There is a moment, and if you have lived it, you will recognize it instantly. When something shifts inside a person who has spent years giving everything they had to someone who gave almost nothing back. It does not happen loudly. There is no dramatic confrontation, no screaming match, no ultimatum delivered through tears. It happens quietly, internally, like a door closing somewhere deep inside the chest. And in that silence, that profound, unshakable silence, something extraordinary begins. The super empath stops talking, and that is when the narcissist starts to break. To understand why this matters, we have to go back to the beginning, not the beginning of the relationship, but the beginning of the dynamic. Because what most people do not realize is that a super empath and a narcissist do not simply find each other by accident. They are drawn together by something that looks, on the surface, like chemistry, like fate, like the kind of connection people write songs about. But underneath that electricity is something far more precise. The narcissist, whether consciously or not, is scanning for a very specific type of person. Not just someone kind, not just someone patient, someone whose capacity for empathy is so vast, so deep, so almost supernatural in its reach, that they will do something no one else will do. They will keep trying to understand someone who does not want to be understood. They will keep offering warmth to someone who feeds on warmth without ever returning it. They will stay. And the super empath stays. For a long time, they stay, not out of weakness. This is the most important thing to understand, not out of weakness, but out of a profound and genuine belief that love is supposed to be unconditional. That if they could just communicate better, give more clearly, love more patiently, something would shift. The narcissist would finally see them, finally meet them, finally become the person the empath always sensed was buried somewhere underneath all that armor. So the empath pours and pours and pours into a vessel with no bottom. Now here is where this story diverges from what you have been told. Most content about empaths and narcissists frames the empath as a victim. And to be clear, the harm is real. The confusion is real. The emotional exhaustion is real. But the super empath is not simply a victim. The super empath is something rarer and more dangerous to a narcissist than anyone gives them credit for. They are, in fact, the one type of person a narcissist cannot fully control. Not because the empath is immune to manipulation. They are not, at least not at first. But because the super empath's emotional intelligence eventually surpasses the narcissist's emotional strategy. And when that happens, everything changes. Let us talk about what a super empath actually is, because the word gets used loosely and it deserves precision. A super empath is not simply someone who feels deeply. Most people feel deeply. A super empath has an almost forensic ability to read the emotional landscape of a room, a conversation, a relationship. They do not just feel what others feel, they track it. They notice the micro expressions, the slight change in tone, the way a person's story shifts when they are uncomfortable, the gap between what someone says and what their body communicates. They are essentially emotional detectives, and they bring that same forensic attention to the people they love most. This is exactly why the narcissist chose them, because in the early stages, all of that attention feels intoxicating to a narcissistic personality. To be truly seen, or at least to feel truly seen, is something the narcissist both craves and fears at a foundational level. The empath's gaze feels like sunlight at first, warm, illuminating, safe, but there is a problem. The same ability that makes the super empath so magnetically attractive to the narcissist is the very ability that will eventually see through them. And a narcissist who is seen, truly seen, past the performance and the persona, does not feel loved. They feel exposed. And exposure for a narcissistic structure is existential threat. So the tactics begin. And if you have been in this dynamic, you already know them, even if you did not always have the language for them. The hot and cold, the intermittent reinforcement, warmth given and then withdrawn without explanation, leaving the empath confused and working harder to get back to that warmth. The subtle criticisms wrapped in humor, the gaslighting, that particular cruelty of having your reality consistently rewritten until you begin to distrust your own perception. The triangulation, bringing in other people, other options, other admirers to keep the empath in a state of low-grade anxiety that masquerades as passion. And through all of it, the empath does what empaths do. They try to understand, they extend grace. They search for the wound underneath the behavior because their nature will not allow them to simply write someone off as bad. They need to understand the why. But here is what the narcissist never accounts for. Grace has a limit, not because the super empath becomes cold or cruel. They do not, that is not who they are. But because the human nervous system was not designed to sustain itself in a permanent state of emotional confusion without eventually arriving at clarity. And for a super empath, clarity, when it comes, is devastating in its completeness. It is not a flicker of doubt. It is not a bad week that passes. It is a full, quiet, unalterable recognition. I have been loving someone who does not love me back the way I deserve. And more than that, I have been changing myself, shrinking myself, second-guessing myself to accommodate a dynamic that was never designed for my flourishing. It was designed for my depletion. That recognition does not announce itself with fireworks. It arrives like dawn, gradual, then suddenly, unmistakably there. And the morning after that recognition, the super empath does something the narcissist has never seen them do. They go quiet, not the silence of hurt, not the silence of waiting to be chased, the silence of someone who has made a decision so deep in their bones that there is nothing left to perform, no anger to express, no ultimatum to deliver, no final attempt at explanation, just silence. And that silence, that particular silence, is the beginning of the narcissist's undoing. To understand why the silent treatment from a super empath hits a narcissist so differently than it hits anyone else, you have to understand what silence means in the architecture of a narcissistic personality. For most people, silence from someone they love produces sadness, longing, a desire to reconnect. These are the natural emotional responses of a nervous system that is built for genuine attachment. But for a narcissist, silence from a pry, mere source of validation, does not simply produce sadness. It produces something closer to panic. And that panic, when you understand where it comes from, reveals everything about what the relationship was actually built on. The narcissist's entire psychological structure depends on what is called narcissistic supply. This is not a casual term. It describes something that functions at a neurological and psychological level, almost like oxygen for the narcissistic ego. Admiration, attention, emotional reactions, even conflict. All of it counts as supply because all of it confirms that the narcissist exists, matters, and has power over someone else. The specific type of supply that a super empath provides is not ordinary supply. It is premium supply because the empath's attention is not passive or shallow. It is deep, consistent, extraordinarily attuned, and colored by genuine love. When a super empath looks at the narcissist, really looks at them, the narcissist feels more real, more significant, more worthy than they feel in almost any other relationship. This is why the narcissist works so hard to keep the empath engaged, even through confusion, even through cruelty, even through cycles that should have ended the relationship long ago. The empath's gaze is irreplaceable. So when that gaze disappears, not in anger, not with tears, not with demands, but simply, quietly, calm. Flatly, the narcissist's internal world begins to destabilize in ways they are entirely unprepared for. And this is the crucial distinction that most people miss. The narcissist has experienced people going quiet before. They have experienced partners withdrawing in hurt, in protest, in the manipulation. They know how to handle those silences because those silences still contain them. A hurt person's silence still orbits the narcissist. It is still about them, still waiting for them, still needing something from them. The narcissist knows intuitively that if they apply the right amount of charm, the right gesture, the right words, delivered at the right moment, the silence will crack. The person will come back. The supply will resume. But the super empath silence is structurally different. And on some level, even if they cannot articulate it, the narcissist feels that difference immediately. Because the super empath silence does not orbit the narcissist. It has its own gravitational center. It is not waiting. It is not hoping. It is not a negotiating tactic dressed up as distance. It is the silence of someone who has genuinely, completely turned their attention inward, back toward themselves, their own healing, their own life, and in doing so has effectively removed the narcissist from the center of their emotional universe. For the first time in the relationship, the soup, our empathy is not thinking about the narcissist. They are thinking about themselves. And the narcissist, who has built an entire relational strategy around remaining the most important thing in the empathist's inner world, suddenly finds themselves in a position they have never occupied before. Irrelevance. Now watch what happens next, because this is where the narcissist's mask begins to slip in ways that are almost clinical in their predictability. The first response is almost always a hoovering attempt. The term comes from the vacuum cleaner brand. The narcissist tries to suck the empath back in. This can take many forms. A sudden reappearance with warmth and charm, as if nothing happened. A text that reopens old intimacy. A crisis, real or manufactured, that requires the empath's care and attention. An apology that sounds, on the surface, like genuine accountability, but is in its architecture a bid for re-engagement rather than a true reckoning with harm caused. These attempts are often perfectly calibrated to the empath's specific emotional vulnerabilities because the narcissist has spent years studying exactly what makes the empath respond. And here is the first test. Because when these attempts arrive, the super empath feels them. Do not mistake silence for the absence of feeling. The super empath is not numb. They are not indifferent. In many cases, they still love the now. Resist in some deep and complicated way that they may carry for years when the hoovering attempt arrives. Something in the empath's nervous system remembers the good moments, the warmth of the early days, the person they believed the narcissist could be. The pull is real. It would be dishonest to pretend otherwise. But the super empath has arrived at something that changes the equation entirely. They have arrived at clarity, and clarity, once it is genuine, acts as an immune system against manipulation, not because the manipulation is no longer felt, but because it is now seen for exactly what it is while it is happening. The empath can feel the pull and simultaneously recognize the architecture of the pull. They can experience the nostalgia and simultaneously remember with precision what came after every previous time they answered it. So the silence holds. And this is when the second phase of the narcissist's unraveling begins. When charm fails, the narcissist escalates. This is almost universal. The escalation can look like many things depending on the narcissist's particular style. Some become overtly angry, sending messages that are accusatory, blame-shifting, rewriting the history of the relationship to cast the empath as the villain for daring to withdraw. Some become performative in their pain, publicly or privately displaying a level of suffering designed to gagger the empath's innate compassion and pull them back into caretaking mode. Some go in the opposite direction entirely, performing indifference, suddenly appearing very publicly happy, very visibly thriving, surrounding themselves with new people and new attention in an attempt to provoke jealousy and make the empath feel the sting of being replaced. Each of these escalations shares a common thread. They are all, at their root, attempts to make the empath react, to break the silence, to generate any kind of emotional response that confirms the narcissist still has power over the empath's internal state. Because for the narcissist, even negative engagement is better than no engagement. Anger from the empath is supply. Jealousy from the empath is supply. Grief from the empath, if it is directed at the narcissist, is supply. The one thing the narcissist cannot metabolize, the one response for which they have no counter strategy, is genuine indifference rooted not in coldness, but in the completion of grief. When the super empath has already felt the loss fully, already mourned what the relationship was and what it would never be, and has come out the other side into something quieter and more solid, the narcissist's escalations land in a vacuum. There is no reaction to harvest, no wound to reopen, no lever left to pull. And in that vacuum, for the first time, perhaps, in their alt life, the narcissist is left alone with themselves, with no supply coming in, with no empath attention to reflect them back as exceptional and powerful and desired. The narcissist faces something they have spent their entire life engineering their existence to avoid: the silence inside themselves. The emptiness that the super empath's love was always temporarily filling. That confrontation, however briefly it lasts, however quickly they flee it by finding new supply elsewhere, is the beginning of the only kind of breaking that actually means something. Not the breaking of the relationship, the breaking of the illusion. There is something that nobody tells you about the super empath's silence that is perhaps the most important thing of all. It is not a strategy. This is the detail that separates it from every other form of withdrawal the narcissist has encountered and successfully dismantled. When someone goes quiet as a tactic to provoke, to punish, to manipulate a response, there is always a thread of connection still running between them and the person they are trying to affect. The silence is performed for an audience. It is, at its core, still relational, still about the other person, still waiting for something to change on the other side. The narcissist, who is exquisitely attuned to the emotional weather of other people, precisely because their survival has always depended on reading and managing those around them, can feel that thread. And as long as that thread exists, they know the silence will eventually break. But the super empath's silence, when it is real, when it has arrived out of genuine completion rather than calculated withdrawal, has no thread. It is not performed for anyone. It is not waiting for anything. And this absence of thread is something the narcissist encounters, perhaps for the first time in their life, with genuine bewilderment, because they do not have a framework for it. Their entire relational map has been built around the assumption that everyone ultimately needs something from them, that every person in their life can be located on a spectrum between wanting their approval and fearing their disapproval. The super empath, in the fullness of their silence, has stepped off that spectrum entirely. They have become, in the most profound sense, unavailable. Not geographically, not even necessarily in terms of contact, unavailable at the level of emotional investment. And that specific unavailability is the narcissist's deepest, most unspoken fear made real. Now let us talk about what is happening inside the super empath during this period, because the external silence is only half the story. What the world sees, or rather what the narcissist perceives, is absence, withdrawal, stillness, but inside the Sue. Per empath, during the same period, something extraordinarily active is taking place. Something that can only be described as a reclamation. Think about what the super empath has spent months or years doing inside this relationship. Every morning they woke up and a significant portion of their emotional and cognitive energy went immediately toward the narcissist. How are they feeling today? What mood are they in? What will keep the peace? What did that comment last night really mean? How can I explain myself more clearly so they understand? How can I love them better so they finally feel safe enough to open up. The super empath's inner life became, over time, almost entirely organized around decoding and responding to someone else. Their own needs, their own desires, their own interior world got progressively quieter as the narcissist's presence grew louder and more consuming. The silence, therefore, is not just the absence of communication with the narcissist. It is the return of the super empathist to themselves. It is the slow, sometimes disorienting, deeply necessary process of remembering who they were before someone else's emotional chaos became the weather they lived inside. And this process is not always graceful. There are days inside the silence that are heavy with grief. Not grief for the narcissist as they actually are, but grief for the relationship the empath believe. They were building grief for the version of the narcissist that appeared in the early days, that warm, attentive, seemingly vulnerable person who made the empath feel for perhaps the first time in their life that their capacity for deep love was not too much but exactly right. That version of the narcissist was real enough to fall in love with, and grieving them, grieving what they represented and what they promised, is legitimate and necessary work. But here is what makes the super empath's grieving process different from what the narcissist expects and counts on. The super empath does not grieve outwardly toward the narcissist. They do not reach out in their worst moments. They do not send the 3 a.m. message. They do not post things on social media that are clearly directed at the narcissist and designed to be seen. They take their grief somewhere private, into therapy, into trusted friendships, into journals, into long walks and difficult conversations with themselves. They metabolize it internally, which is harder and slower and infinitely more powerful than externalizing it would be, because every time grief is externalized toward the narcissist, it becomes supply. It confirms that the narcissist is still central, still the most important emotional event in the empath's life. The super empath, either intuitively or through hard-earned wisdom, understab this, and so they protect their grief. They do not perform it for the one who caused it. And as the grief moves through them and begins to clear, something else emerges underneath it that surprises even the empath themselves. Anger, clean, clarifying, entirely legitimate anger, not the hot, reactive anger that the narcissist provoked so many times during the relationship and used to destabilize and dismiss the empath. This is different. This is the anger that arrives when the full picture finally comes into focus. When the empath stops trying to understand the narcissist and starts, perhaps for the first time, truly witnessing their own experience. What was done to them? How many times their perception was corrected when it was accurate? How many times they apologized for things that were not their fault? How many times they made themselves smaller, quieter, less to accommodate someone who was taking up all the space and calling it love? That anger is not destructive. It is structural. It is the spine reforming. This is the phase where the super empath becomes, in a very real sense, dangerous to the narcissistic dynamic. Not dangerous in a vindictive way. The super empath is not built for revenge and does not need it. Dangerous in the sense that they are no longer available to participate in the script. The narcissist's entire relational strategy depends on a co-author. It depends on someone who will respond to the push and pull, who will chase when withdrawn from, who will collapse under criticism and work harder to earn approval, who will absorb blame and internalize it as personal failure rather than recognizing it as a deflection tactic. The super empath, in their anger and their clarity, has stopped being that co-author. They have put the pen down, and a script with only one author is not a relationship. It is a monologue, and monologues, no matter how practiced, echo in an empty room. Outside, during this same period, the narcissist is accelerating because the absence of response has now persisted long enough to breach the narcissist's internal threshold of tolerance. Remember that the narcissist's most fundamental fear is not abandonment in the way we conventionally understand it. It is irrelevance. Abandonment can be reframed. The narcissist can tell themselves and others that they chose to leave, that they were too evolved for the relationship, that the empath was too needy or too cold or too something. But irrelevance cannot be reframed. Irrelevance means the story is being told without you. It means someone who once organized their entire emotional life around your presence has genuinely moved the center of their world elsewhere. And that, for a personality structured entirely around being the most important person in the room, is just painful. It is identity threatening. So the narcissist does what the narcissist always does when their identity is threatened. They perform louder, more visibly, more desperately than before, even if the desperation is dressed in the costume of confidence. New relationships are displayed prominently. New achievements are announced. New versions of the charming, successful, desirable self are projected outward with increasing intensity. All of it, every post, every story, every casual mention dropped into mutual circles is aimed at one audience, the super empathist who is no longer watching. The tragedy of this performance, and it is a genuine tragedy when you understand the psychological architecture underneath it, is that it confirms everything the empath already knows. Someone who had genuinely moved on would not need the audience they pretended to have lost. The performance is the proof of the wound. And the wound has always been there long before the empath arrived, long before the relationship began. A wound so old and so deep that an entire personality was constructed around never having to feel it directly. Here is the question that matters most, and it is the one that almost nobody asks. Not what happens to the narcissist when the super empath goes silent, though that unraveling is real, and it is significant. But what happens to the super empath? What does life look like on the other side of a relationship that asked them to be less than they were for longer than they should have allowed? Because this is ultimately not a story about breaking a narcissist. It was never really about the narcissist at all. It is a story about a person reclaiming the full dimensions of who they are after spending years in a space that could not hold them. And that reclamation is not simple. It is not a single moment of empowerment followed by effortless healing. It is layered and non-linear and sometimes extraordinarily lonely. But it is also, for the super empath who commits to it fully and honestly, the beginning of the most important relationship they will ever have, the one with themselves. Let us be precise about something that the internet gets badly wrong when it discusses super empaths. The narrative that circulates most widely is seductive in its simplicity. The empath suffers, awakens, goes silent. The narcissist crumbles. The empath walks away victorious and transformed, radiating light and boundaries and self-worth. And while the broad strokes of that arc contain truth, the version that gets left out, the part between the silence and the triumph, is the part that actually does the healing. It is the part where the super empath has to sit with the most uncomfortable question of all. Not why did the narcissist treat me this way, but what did I stay? Not as a self-punishment, not as an exercise in self-blame that simply relocates the wound rather than treating it, but as a genuine, courageous inquiry into the parts of themselves that made the dynamic feel for a long time like home. Because the super empath did not arrive at this relationship as a blank slate. They arrive with their own history, their own early experiences of love that perhaps taught them long before the narcissist ever appeared, that love requires effort to be earned, that their needs are secondary to the needs of the people they care for, that their role in a relationship is to understand and to give and to hold, and that receiving is somehow less natural, less safe, less familiar than perpetual giving. Many super empaths grew up in environments where their emotional sensitivity was either treated as a gift to be utilized by others or a burden to be managed and suppressed, where they learned very early to read the room, to regulate the emotional temperature of their family, to be attuned to everyone else's inner world, because attending to their own felt either impossible or dangerous. The narcissist did not create these patterns in the super empath. The narcissist simply recognized them, moved into them, and set up residence. This is not blame, this is liberation, because the moment the super empath understands that the dynamic was not dum-nam, that there is a thread running from their earliest experiences of love through every relationship pattern they have carried into adulthood, is the moment the dynamic loses its power to repeat. You cannot accidentally heal. You cannot stumble into different relationship patterns simply by leaving the narcissist and finding someone kinder. The patterns travel with you until you turn around and face them directly. And the super empath, with all of their emotional intelligence, all of their capacity for deep, honest self-reflection, is uniquely positioned to do exactly that. More positioned, in fact, than most people ever become. Because the relationship with the narcissist, brutal as it was, gave them something that cannot be purchased or rushed. It gave them absolute clarity about the difference between love that expands you and love that diminishes you, between connection that is rooted in genuine mutual seeing and connection that is rooted in one person's need to be mirrored and the other person's compulsion to provide that mirror. They know now in their body and their nervous system and their bones what it feels like when someone is taking rather than meeting. And that knowing is not just knowledge, it is a compass. So what does the super empath do with all of this? What does the other side of this silence actually look like when it is lived honestly rather than REM for an audience? It looks first like radical self-return. The energy that was poured outward constantly, exhaustingly, in the direction of someone who could never be filled, begins to flow back inward. The super empath starts noticing their own emotional landscape with the same forensic attention they once devoted entirely to the narcissist. What do I actually feel right now, not in response to someone else, but independently, genuinely mine? What do I want? Not as a negotiation with someone else's preferences, but as a true expression of my own desires. What kind of relationships actually make me feel more like myself rather than less? These questions sound simple. For someone who spent years not asking them, they are revolutionary. It also looks like the careful, deliberate rebuilding of boundaries, and not the kind of boundaries that get described in self-help content as walls you erect to keep people out. Real boundaries are not walls. They are not defenses. They are expressions of self-knowledge. They are the natural consequence of knowing clearly what you value, what you will participate in, and what you will not. The super empath post-narcissist does not build boundaries out of fear or bitterness. They build them out of the deep, hard-won understanding of what happens when boundaries are absent. They know the cost. They paid it. And that knowledge makes the boundary not a restriction, but a form of self-respect, so fundamental it no longer requires defense or justification. It simply exists as naturally as the super empath themselves exist. And then quietly and without announcement, something begins to happen that the super empath did not fully anticipate. The gifts that the relationship with the narcissist almost extinguished begin to return. The sensitivity that was weaponized against them. You are too emotional. You are too intense. You feel too much. Reveals itself in the absence of someone who feared and exploited it as the extraordinary capacity it always was. The ability to feel deeply is not a vulnerability. It is a form of perception. It allows the super empath to connect with other people at a level of authenticity that most human beings spend their entire lives hungry for and never quite reach. It allows them to hold space for complexity, for contradiction, for the full and messy spectrum of human experience without flinching. These are not small things. These are the qualities that make someone irreplaceable in the lives of the people fortunate enough to know them well. The narcissist breaks because the super empath stops being the mirror. But the super empathies, because they finally become the subject of their own story rather than the supporting character in someone else's. And that shift from mirror to protagonist, from giver to also receiver, from endlessly understanding others to finally tenderly understanding themselves is not the ending of something. It is the beginning of everything. The silence was never about punishing the narcissist. It was never about winning. It was about creating enough stillness to hear something that had been trying to speak for years. The super empathozone voice, returning, steady, undiminished. And when that voice is heard fully, when it is no longer crowded out by someone else's noise, what it says is simple and it is complete. I am not too much. I was simply in the wrong place. And now finally I am not. Here is what nobody in your life has the courage to tell you. The narcissist in your life, the one you cooked for, cried over, rearranged your entire personality to keep, was sleeping with people you would never in a million years expect. Not because those people were better than you, not because they were more attractive, more exciting, or more interesting. In fact, when you find out who it was, your first reaction is not going to be jealousy. It is going to be confusion. It is going to be that sick, stomach-dropping feeling of, wait, that person? That is when the real damage sets in. Not the betrayal itself, but the specific, targeted humiliation of realizing the person they chose means you were never actually chosen at all. You were just available. And that realization is what this video is going to fully, completely, and honestly explain to you. Because once you understand why a narcissist operates this way, once you see the actual psychological machinery underneath the behavior, you will never again waste a single minute wondering what was wrong with you. Nothing was wrong with you. The problem runs so much deeper than that, and it has nothing to do with your worth. But here's the part your therapist might dance around, the part the soft, gentle, healing content will not say out loud. This was not an accident. It was not weakness. It was not even really about desire. What a narcissist does with intimacy is something far colder, far more calculated, and far more revealing about who they actually are at their core. And you deserve to know exactly what that is. So let us start at the very beginning. Because if you are going to understand this, you have to be willing to throw out everything you thought you knew about what intimacy means. For most people, for you, physical intimacy is connected to something. It is connected to attraction, to feeling safe with someone, to wanting that specific person in a way that is about who they are, not just what they can do. When you were intimate with a narcissist, it meant something to you. You were present. You were giving something real. You were sharing a version of yourself that you do not share with just anyone. That is how a normal, emotionally healthy human being experiences physical closeness. It is tied to personhood. It is tied to meaning. The narcissist was lying in that same bed, in that same moment, experiencing something so fundamentally different that it might as well have been a different act entirely. For them, intimacy has never been about the person. It has never been about you specifically. It has been from the very first moment a transaction, a tool, a means to an end. And once you genuinely understand what end they are trying to reach, the behavior that broke you starts to make a horrible, complete kind of sense. Think about what a transaction actually requires. A transaction does not require the other party to be special. It does not require connection, history, or genuine feeling. A transaction only requires that the other person can deliver what you need in that moment. That is it. That is the entire criteria. So when the narcissist was scanning a room, when they were sliding into someone's messages, when they were making a move on someone you never expected, they were not asking themselves, is this person worth it? They were not thinking about beauty standards or emotional connection or whether this person measured up to you. They were asking one question, and one question only. Can this person give me what I need right now? And what they need, what they are always compulsively, desperately chasing, falls into a very specific set of categories that explain everything. The first is validation. Not the kind of validation you feel when a friend compliments you and you feel good for an hour. The narcissist's need for validation is not an emotion. It is a survival mechanism. Underneath all that confidence, underneath the arrogance and the charm and the way they walk into a room like they own it, there is a core that is completely hollow. There is no stable sense of self in there. No internal voice that quietly confirms, you are enough, you are real, you matter. That voice does not exist for them. So they have to manufacture it constantly, externally. And every single person who says yes to them, every person who finds them attractive enough, compelling enough, worth being intimate with, becomes a data point, evidence, proof that the hollow thing inside is not actually hollow, proof that they are desirable, proof that they exist in a meaningful way. This is why this specific person does not matter. If you are collecting evidence of your own desirability, any piece of evidence will do. You do not get selective about your proof. You accumulate it. Every person who says yes adds to the pile, and the pile temporarily quiets the screaming emptiness underneath. But only temporarily. It always fades. It always requires the next encounter, the next yes, the next piece of evidence, because nothing external can actually fill what is missing internally. The second category is control. And this one is harder to hear, but you need to hear it. There is a specific kind of power that comes from being able to seduce someone, from being able to make a person want you, from taking someone who is resistant or unavailable or committed to someone else and flipping them. For the narcissist, that flip, that moment of conquest, is not about desire. It is about proof of power. It is about demonstrating to themselves that they can override someone's judgment, that they can reach into someone's life and rearrange it. That no boundary is actually a boundary when it comes to them. And here's what makes this particularly cruel in the context of a relationship with you. It was not about those other people being more appealing. It was about the act of conquest itself. The lower the perceived effort required, the more available the person, the more indiscriminate the choice, the cleaner the proof of power. Because if they can get anyone, it means they have unlimited power, not selective power. Absolute power, you need to sit with that for a moment because it reframes the entire story you've been telling yourself. The story you have been telling yourself goes something like this. There must have been something special about those other people, something they had that I did not, something that made them more exciting, more appealing, more worth the risk. And so you have been quietly, painfully auditioning yourself against a cast of people you never even got to meet, measuring yourself against ghosts, wondering what they offered that you could not, wondering what you were missing, wondering what you could have done differently to make yourself enough that the wandering would have stopped. Here is the truth that is going to either devastate you or finally set you free, depending on how ready you are to receive it. There was nothing special about those people. Absolutely nothing. In fact, in many cases, the narcissist did not even like them, did not find them particularly attractive, did not enjoy their company, did not think about them before or after. You were not replaced by someone extraordinary. You were not overlooked in favor of someone who outshone you. The people they chose were chosen for one reason and one reason only. They were there. They were available. They said yes. And in the narcissist psychological economy, that is the only currency that ever mattered. This is the part that people closest to you will never fully understand unless they have lived it. When you try to explain it, when you say the person they were with was someone they openly talked badly about, someone completely unremarkable, someone they did not even respect, people on the outside will look at you with confused sympathy and say things like, well, maybe they had a connection you did not see. Maybe there was more to it. And you will sit there knowing with a bone-deep certainty that there was not. There was nothing there. And somehow that nothing is more painful than everything could ever be. Because nothing means you are never being compared to a rival. You are being compared to a function. And you fulfilled that function just as well as anyone else could have. Which means the you that you brought to that relationship, your specific laugh, your particular way of loving, your history, your effort, your sacrifice, none of it was ever the point. You could have been anyone that is not a reflection of your worth. That is a reflection of their incapacity. But understanding that distinction intellectually and actually feeling it in your body are two completely different things. And we are going to get there. First, though, you need to understand the third category of what they are chasing, because this one goes deeper than validation or control. This one is about something almost unbearable to look at directly. The narcissist is running from themselves, not in a poetic metaphorical sense, in a very real, very clinical sense. The narcissist exists in a state of near constant disconnection from their own inner experience. Psychologists call it dissociation. What it means practically is this: there is a version of themselves they cannot tolerate, a core self they built an entire personality structure on top of in order to never have. We, to feel that buried self, is the one that believes it is worthless, unlovable, defective in some fundamental way that cannot be repaired. The grandiosity, the charm, the arrogance, all of it is armor. All of it is architecture built to keep that buried self from ever surfacing. But armor is exhausting to wear. And the silence underneath it, the emptiness, the void, the sense of not quite existing, that silence gets loud. It gets unbearable. And when it does, physical intimacy becomes a drug. Not a metaphor for a drug, an actual functional equivalent of a drug. Because what intense physical sensation does, what the rush of pursuit, the high of conquest, the overwhelming nature of an intimate encounter does, is cut through the dissociation. For a few minutes, sometimes less, the narcissist actually feels something. They are in their body, they are present. The void goes quiet. They exist, and then it fades, faster than it came. The emptiness rushes back in like water filling a space, and they are right back where they started, numb, disconnected, hollow, chasing the next moment that will make them feel real again. This is why the behavior is compulsive. This is why it does not stop even when the consequences are catastrophic. This is why someone can risk a relationship they claim to value, a life they have built, a partner they profess to love, for something that meant absolutely nothing, because they are not making a rational choice between you and another person. They are not weighing your worth against someone else's appeal. They are reaching for the only thing that reliably turns the volume down on their internal suffering for even a few minutes. And in that moment of reaching, the person they reach for is almost completely irrelevant. What matters is the sensation. What matters is the temporary silence. What matters is feeling real, even briefly, even real, only even at enormous cost to everyone around them. I need you to understand something here, because there is a version of this explanation that lets the narcissist entirely off the hook. And I am not giving you that version. Yes, they are damaged. Yes, there is genuine psychological suffering underneath the behavior. Yes, in some clinical sense, they are operating from a place of profound deficit rather than deliberate malice in every single moment. All of that is true, and none of it makes what they did to you acceptable. None of it means you were wrong to expect fidelity, honesty, basic human decency. None of it means you should have stayed or tried harder or loved them better. A person can be broken and still be responsible for the damage they cause. A person can be suffering and still be someone you were right to leave. Understanding why someone hurt you is not the same as excusing it. And it is certainly not the same as going back. What it is, what this understanding is actually for, is to finally, completely, and permanently remove yourself from the center of a story you were never actually part of. Because as long as you believe those other people had something you did not, you will keep auditioning, keep improving, keep trying to become someone impossible to betray. And that project has no finish line. It will consume you. So let the truth land. They were not choosing them over you. They were not even seeing you. They were feeding something that has nothing to do with you, using whoever was closest, whoever was available, whoever said yes first. Now we need to talk about the part that nobody warns you about. The part that does not show up in the early stages, when everything still feels like love and effort and being chosen. The part that only becomes visible in hindsight, once you are far enough away to see the whole picture. Because here is what your competitor's content will not tell you plainly enough. When a narcissist is in a committed relationship with you, when they have a primary partner, a home base, a person they return to, their indiscriminate behavior outside that relationship is not just a symptom of their damage. It is also, whether they are fully conscious of it or not, a weapon. And the specific indiscriminate quality of it, the fact that it is anyone, everyone, people clearly beneath the standard you thought they held, that is not a side effect of the weapon. That is the weapon itself. Let me show you exactly how this works. Because once you see it, you cannot unsee it. And that visibility is what protects you going forward. When you discovered or suspected or slowly pieced together that the narcissist had been intimate with someone else, what was your first emotional response? For most people, it is a specific cocktail. Shock, obviously, grief, anger. But underneath all of those, underneath the surface reactions, there is something quieter and more corrosive happening. A question. The question is not just how could they, the question is why that person. And the moment you ask why that person, you have already stepped into the trap. Because now you are not thinking about their betrayal, you are thinking about your inadequacy. You are running a comparison you can never win because the comparison was never real. You are asking yourself what they had that made them worth the risk, which means you are implicitly asking what you lacked that made you not enough to prevent it. That pivot from their behavior to your worth is not accidental. It is the entire point. A narcissist who is intimate with someone obviously exceptional, someone you could look at and say, all right, I understand the attraction, gives you a narrative you can survive. It hurts, but it makes sense. It positions you as someone who lost out to genuine competition. You grieve, you rebuild, and eventually you move forward with your dignity somewhat intact. But a narcissist who is intimate with someone you cannot fathom, someone unremarkable, someone they openly criticize, someone completely unsuitable, gives you nothing to hold on to. There's no narrative that protects you. There's only the raw, humiliating message anyone would do, including people far less remarkable than you, which means your remarkableness was never protection. Your effort was never leverage. You were interchangeable. And that specific message, delivered not through words, but through the sheer indiscriminate nature of the behavior, is one of the most effective tools of psychological demolition ever deployed in a relationship. It does not just hurt you, it destabilizes you at the foundation. It makes you question your own value in a way that outlasts the relationship by years. Think about what it does to your sense of safety. If the narcissist had standards, even terrible, selfish, unfaithful standards, you would at least know what you were dealing with. You could assess the threat. You could identify the type of person they gravitated toward and either compete or walk away with a clear understanding of the incompatibility. But when there are no standards, when literally anyone qualifies, there is no safety anywhere. There is no version of being a better partner that protects you. There is no achievement, no physical standard, no level of devotion that puts you beyond reach of replacement, because replacement requires a bar, and there is no bar. That groundlessness is not a byproduct of their behavior. For the narcissist, keeping you groundless is a feature. A destabilized partner is a manageable partner. A partner who is constantly questioning their own worth is a partner who is to be. Us trying to earn their place, to clearly see what is happening to them. A partner drowning in self-doubt does not have the emotional bandwidth to issue ultimatums, maintain boundaries, or walk away. This is why you stayed longer than you should have, not because you were weak, not because you were stupid, because the specific nature of the betrayal was engineered, consciously or not, to keep you exactly where you were. Confused, self-doubting, working harder, loving more desperately, trying to become the version of yourself that would finally be enough. There is no such version. There never was. And the narcissist on some level needed you to never figure that out. Now here is where it gets even more deliberately cruel, because I need to address something they almost certainly said to you when the behavior came to light. They said it did not mean anything. Maybe they said it defensively. Maybe they said it almost casually, as if that made it better. It did not mean anything. And you sat there trying to figure out if that was supposed to be comforting, because it felt like the opposite, because something in you understood, even if you could not articulate it yet, that them meaning nothing by it was not exonerating. It was the most damning thing they could have said. Here is why. When a person who is capable of genuine connection has an affair, that affair typically means something to them. There is usually emotional involvement, real attraction, some form of genuine feeling, however wrong, however damaging to everyone involved. The betrayal is catastrophic, but it is at least a betrayal committed by a full human being who felt something. When the narcissist says it meant nothing, they are telling you the truth. It genuinely meant nothing. The person was interchangeable. The encounter was mechanical. There was no feeling underneath it beyond the temporary relief of a need being met, but they present this absence of meaning as a defense, as if the fact that they felt nothing makes the betrayal smaller, as if their emotional disconnection from their own behavior is somehow your reason to be less hurt. What they are actually telling you, what the honest translation of it did not mean anything, is, I am someone for whom intimacy carries no inherent meaning at all. I am someone who can be physically intimate with another person and feel nothing about it, attach nothing to it, and return to you without a second thought. And you are supposed to find that reassuring. You are supposed to hear that and think, oh, good, I have nothing to worry about. Instead of hearing what it actually is, a confession that the person you built a life with, the person you trusted with your body and your future, has been moving through the world treating physical intimacy as a transaction with no emotional content whatsoever, including, by extension, with you. That is the part that lands last and hits hardest. When they say it meant nothing about those other encounters, you eventually have to ask yourself, did it mean something with me? Or were you also, in some moments you thought were sacred, just another transaction, just another person who was available, just another temporary answer to a hunger that was never really about you? That question, did it ever really mean anything with me, is the one that tends to surface around 3 a.m. When the house is quiet and the defenses are down, and you are left alone with the version of the story you have not yet been able to fully face. And I am not going to tell you the answer does not matter, because it does. It matters enormously. What I am going to tell you is this. Even if some of it was real, even if there were genuine moments, genuine warmth, something that functioned like connection, it was always operating inside a framework that made sustainable love impossible, because you cannot truly love someone you do not see, and the narcissist has never fully seen you. They saw what you provided. They saw the validation, the stability, the reflection of themselves that you offered back. They saw the function you served in the architecture of their life. But the you underneath all of that, the specific, irreplaceable, complicated human being who showed up every day and chose them, that person was never fully real to them. Not because you were not worth seeing, because they do not have the capacity to see anyone that way. This is not poetic cruelty. This is clinical reality. The narcissist's entire psychological structure is organized around themselves as the center of every experience. Other people exist in their world as satellites, as supporting cast, as sources of supply or obstacles to it. The idea of another person having an interior life as rich and real and valid as their own, a life that deserves consideration, protection, care, that concept does not land for them the way it lands for you. Empathy, real empathy, is not just feeling bad when someone cries in front of you. Real empathy is the ability to hold another person's reality as genuinely mattering, even when it costs you something. Even when honoring their reality means overriding your own impulse. Even when it means saying no to something you want because the impact on them is more important than the momentary satisfaction for you. That capacity, that fundamental ability to let another person's humanity override your own appetite, is exactly what the narcissist does not have. And without it, fidelity is not a choice they make. It is a constraint they lack the internal architecture to maintain. You were never going to love them into it. You were never going to be patient enough, beautiful enough, devoted enough, or understanding enough to install a conscience in someone who was not built with one. That is not a failure of your love. That is a limit of human possibility. And the sooner that truth settles into your bones, not just your mind, but your body, your nervous system, the part of you that still flinches when your phone buzzes, the sooner you can stop carrying weight that was never yours to carry. Here is what I need you to understand about where you go from here. The damage the narcissist did was real. The years of self-questioning, the recalibrated sense of your own worth, the way you now sometimes catch yourself shrinking in rooms you used to own, that is real and it deserves to be taken seriously. But here is what is also real. The story they told you about yourself was a lie, not a mistake, not a misunderstanding, a lie embedded in behavior, in indifference, in the calculated chaos of being with someone who treated your love like a renewable resource they never had to earn. You are not interchangeable. You are not replaceable. You are not the person their behavior implied you were. You are someone who loved with their whole chest in a situation that was structurally designed to make that love feel like it was never enough. And the fact that it was never enough had nothing, not one single thing, to do with how much of it you gave. The narcissist will move on to the next person with the same hunger and the same emptiness and the same indiscriminate reaching. And that person will eventually sit where you are sitting right now, asking the same questions, running the same comparisons, doing the same painful math. Because the problem was never the partner. It was never you. It is always only the void they carry inside them that no external person has ever been able to fill, that no amount of intimacy has ever been able to quiet. For longer than a moment, they are not out there now, finally fixed, finally capable, finally giving someone else the love they withheld from you. They are out there doing exactly what they always did, needing exactly what they always needed, leaving exactly the kind of wreckage they always leave. And you are the one who gets to be done with it. You are the one who gets to take everything you learned in that relationship, every hard, humiliating, clarifying lesson, and use it to build a life that is not organized around managing someone else's emptiness. You get to stop being available for transactions. You get to stop being the person who shows up fully, completely, and honestly for someone who is constitutionally incapable of doing the same. You get to want more than that. You get to expect more than that. You get to walk into the next chapter of your life knowing exactly what you are looking for, knowing exactly what the red flags feel like before they become catastrophes, knowing the difference between someone who sees you and someone who is simply using your reflection to see themselves. That knowledge costs you everything. It costs you years and peace and versions of yourself you will never fully get back. But it is yours now. And no one, not the narcissist, not the next person, not the quiet voice in your head at 3 a.m, can take it away from you. You were never the problem. You were never too much or not enough. You were just in the wrong story, giving a real performance for an audience of one who was only ever watching themselves. Now you know. And knowing is where everything different begins.